The rancher paid for the beautiful sister, but the plain one stepped off instead. The letter said Clara. I'd read it so many times the fold had gone soft, the ink rubbed faint where my thumb had dragged across her name. Clara Holt, 22 years old, accomplished in household arts, photograph enclosed. I'd looked at the photograph so many times I'd stopped seeing it, which is a thing that happens with photographs, I've found. You stare long enough and the face becomes a pattern of light and dark, and then it stops being a person. But I had the letter, I had the name, and I had a plan which is more than I'd had for the better part of 10 years. I want to be straight with you about why I did it, not because I was lonesome, though I was. Not because the house needed a woman's hand, though it did. I did it because I was 49 years old and I had built something on this land that a man ought to be proud of, 2,000 acres of good grass, a main house with glass windows, a well that hadn't gone dry in 6 summers, a herd that had come through 3 hard winters and still stood, and there was no one to hand it to. No one who would carry it after me. That is a particular kind of hollow that gets into a man. Not grief, exactly. More like looking at a lamp with no wick. So I wrote to the Holt family in St. Louis through the agency, and they wrote back, and we reached an arrangement, and I wired the money for the train fare in March. And by the first week of April, I was standing on the platform at Deming with my hat in my hands. I'd worn my good coat. I want you to understand that. The wool one with the bone buttons that I'd bought in Santa Fe 2 years prior and worn exactly once to the funeral of a man I barely knew. I had cleaned my boots. I had shaved that morning in cold water because the stove was being contrary and I hadn't wanted to wait. There was a cut along my jaw I could still feel if I turned my head a certain way. The train was 40 minutes late, and I stood there in the April wind with the other men who'd come to collect cargo and watched the platform fill and empty twice over. A man selling tamales from a cart kept looking at me with what I took to be sympathy, and I did not care for it. Then the train came. I watched the cars empty out. Drummers with their cases, a family with 3 children who ran straight into the dirt and shrieked like something was wrong with them, a priest, 2 soldiers, an old Navajo man who walked like each step cost him money. I watched the doors. I had the photograph in my coat pocket. I knew the face. And then she stepped off. She was not Clara. I knew that the moment she cleared the steps. Not because she was ugly, she wasn't, but because nothing about her matched the photograph. Wrong height, wrong hair, wrong way of standing, which was straight up with her bag held in both hands in front of her, not like a woman arriving somewhere but like a woman who'd already decided to stay. Clara had been round-faced and bright in that photograph, the kind of bright that photographs well. This woman's face was narrower, sharper in the jaw, with eyes that sat under heavy brows and didn't apologize for it. She found me before I found her. She looked right at me across the platform and didn't look away, and I had just enough time to feel the wrongness of it before she walked directly toward me. She said, "Mr. Gideon Marsh." I said I was. She said, "I'm Nora Holt, Clara's sister." She handed me a letter, not the agency, a real letter, on folded paper from the Holt family. I didn't read it right then. I stood on the platform with the wind working at my good coat and looked at Nora Holt, who looked back at me with the patience of someone who has had to explain something difficult before and has learned to give the other person time. I put the letter in my coat pocket, next to the photograph of her sister. I said, "Is Clara ill?" She said, "No." I said, "Is she dead?" She said, "No, Mr. Marsh. She married a man in Cincinnati in February. She sent a letter. I believe it may have crossed with yours in the post." She didn't look sorry about it. She looked steady, which was something else. I said, "And you're here because?" She said, "Because someone needed to come and explain in person, and because I am 25 years old and unmarried and I need a situation. I know that's plain speaking. I've been told I'm too plain speaking. But you've paid the fare and come to the platform, and I think you deserve the truth of it." The man with the tamales was definitely looking at me now. I put my hat on. I said, well, I drove 4 hours to get here and it's going to be 4 hours back. You can ride or you can stay. It's not my concern either way. She picked up her bag. She said, then let's not waste the daylight. I want to tell you something about that ride. It was 4 hours across country that most people find hard to look at, scrub and red dirt, and the kind of sky that's so big it starts to feel like a threat. I've driven that road so many times I'd stopped seeing it years ago, the way you stop seeing a photograph. But that afternoon I was aware of every mile of it. Not because she didn't talk much. She watched the country go by with the same calm she'd had on the platform, but because her presence was like a stone dropped into still water. Something moved that had not moved in a long time. She asked me once how long I'd been on the land. I said going on 11 years. She said, did you build the house? I said I'd built most of it myself and hired help for the rest. She didn't say anything to that, but she nodded, and it was the nod of a person filing information away, not making a judgment. Near sundown, when the house came into view on the flat, and it does show well from a distance, I'll give it that, the new barn throwing a long shadow and the cottonwoods catching the last light, she said, that's a real thing you made. Not pretty, not nice, a real thing. I felt that in a place I hadn't felt much of anything for a while. She slept in the back room that first night, the one I'd made up for Clara, and I lay awake in my room listening to the house and thinking about what I'd done. Brought a woman I didn't know to a house I'd built alone on an agreement I'd made with a different woman who'd married someone else. The lamp was out and the coyotes were working the far pasture, and I lay there and thought, in the morning, if she wants to go, I'll take her back to Deming. It's a 4-hour drive. She'll have enough money for the train. I'll figure out the rest. In the morning, she was already in the kitchen when I came down. She'd found the coffee and made a proper pot of it, and there was bread she must have brought from the train, sliced and set out. She was looking at the stove, which had a cracked firebox I'd been meaning to fix for 3 months, and when she heard me she turned and said, this stove is going to be a problem. I said, I know. She handed me a cup of coffee. I took it. I did not say thank you because I wasn't sure what we were yet, employer, guest, stranger, something else, and the words seemed to weigh too much for first thing in the morning. But I drank it and it was good, and I stood there in my own kitchen and drank coffee that someone else had made. And that was the first ordinary thing that had happened to me in longer than I could say precisely. I did not ask her to stay. I want to be clear about that. She stayed because she decided to stay, and she told me plainly that she'd decided about a week in and asked if I wanted her to go. What happened in that week was this. She learned the house faster than I would have thought possible. Not the way a woman takes over a house to make it hers, rearranging things and putting her mark on surfaces. She left everything where it was. But she found where things were and she used them right, and she stayed out of my way when I was working, and she asked questions that were worth answering. How many head? What were the water rights? Who held the note on the eastern parcel? What was the trouble with era coals along the north fence? That last question, I stopped walking when she asked it. I said, how did you know about that? She said, Javier mentioned it when he came in for water this morning. Javier was a hand I'd had for 3 years, a quiet man who spoke to me only when necessary and to other people less. For him to talk to her on the first week said something. I told her about era coals. He had a ranch to the north that shared a water access through a draw on my land, access that a previous owner had allowed, and that I had allowed to continue out of something close to habit. And in the last year he had started grazing cattle on my side of the draw, which was not part of any agreement, and when I'd raised it, he'd gotten hostile in a way that had a quality of certainty to it, like a man who knows the law may not be on his side but is betting you won't push it. She listened to all of this. Then she said, do you have the original papers on the draw? I said, somewhere. She said, find them. Not a suggestion, A plain statement of what needed to happen. I found I did not mind it. The stove I fixed. The firebox took me a Sunday afternoon and one trip to town, and when I got the new piece in and the fire drew right, Nora came and looked at it and said, "Good." The way she said most things. No more than it needed. I had started watching her without meaning to. Not the way a man watches a woman he wants, though I won't say there wasn't that, there was, it just wasn't the first or the loudest thing. I watched her the way you watch someone who is good at something. She moved through work with no wasted motion. She was not quick, she was economical. There's a difference. Quick means hurry, economical means nothing is wasted, and the result is the same work done with less damage. She was not beautiful in the way Clara had looked beautiful in the photograph. She had a face that took knowing. The more I looked at it, the more there was to it. The way her jaw set when she was thinking about something she hadn't solved yet. The way her eyes moved when I talked about the land like she was making a map of it. She had a scar on her left hand, thin and white, that ran from the base of her thumb to her wrist, and I thought about asking and then didn't. And then about 3 weeks in she caught me looking at it and said, without preamble, "A broken jar when I was 12. My father's fault, but he was already gone by then, so it didn't matter. I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "Don't be, it healed straight." That was the first real thing she told me about herself. I held it carefully. The trouble with Coles came to a head in May. He sent 3 men onto my land on a Tuesday morning, not to the draw but across the south fence, which had nothing to do with any argument about water rights and everything to do with testing what I'd do. Javier saw them and came to tell me, and I rode out, and Nora came with me on the second horse without asking, and I thought about telling her to go back to the house, and then thought better of it. Cole's men were in the south pasture moving a small bunch of my cattle toward the fence line. Not many, 8, 10 head, but they were moving them. I rode up and I said, "Those are my cattle and this is my land. You'll leave them where they stand and ride back the way you came." The man in front, he was maybe 30, with the look of someone who had been hired specifically for moments like this, said Coles had a legitimate claim on the grazing right through the draw, and this was just him exercising it. I said the grazing right ran through the draw and not an inch beyond it, and we both knew it. And if Coles wanted to have the argument in front of a judge in Deming, I was ready to have it. The man looked at me, the way men like that look at a man alone. Except I wasn't alone. Nora sat her horse on my left side, easy, with the rifle that usually hung in the kitchen doorway laid across her saddle bow. She wasn't pointing it. She wasn't doing anything dramatic with it. She was simply there, and it was simply there, and she was looking at Cole's man with the same level patience she brought to everything. He looked at her. He looked back at me. He said they'd be riding back. They rode back. Nora and I sat our horses and watched them go. When they were far enough that it didn't matter, she let out a breath, slow and long, and shifted the rifle to a more comfortable position, and she said, "You'll want to file those papers this week." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'll come with you to Deming." I said, "All right." We rode back in the morning quiet with the sun well up and the grass throwing long green shadows, and I thought, there are men on this earth who will never have a thing like this beside them. A woman who rides out. A woman who brings the rifle and doesn't flourish it and doesn't tremble. A woman who's already thinking about the next step when the trouble's still in your blood. I did not say any of that. I didn't have words for it yet, but I felt it like a change in the weather. Something was different in my chest than it had been 2 months prior, and I knew what it was. There is something I need to tell you about what I was before Nora came. I had been for the better part of a decade a man who worked. That is not a modest thing to say, I mean it precisely. I worked the way some men drink, steadily and without cease, not because I loved the work but because the work was what kept the quiet from getting too loud. I had a wife once. Her name was Rose, and she died in the winter of '84 from a fever that started as a cough and ended in 3 weeks. We had been married 2 years. We had not had children, which is a sentence I have never been able to say out loud without it costing something. After Rose, I built things. That's what I did. I bought the land that nobody wanted because the aquifer was supposed to be too deep, and I dug until I found water, and then I built the house and the barn and the fences and the reputation, one season at a time, until I had something a man could point to. And that was enough. I told myself it was enough. I told myself that a man who builds something out of nothing has nothing to apologize for and doesn't need a witness. But that is not entirely true, is it? A thing built in the dark is still in the dark. What I am telling you is that by the time Nora Holt stepped off that train, I had spent so long working alone that I had almost forgotten there was another way to be. Not forgotten in my mind, I knew perfectly well, the way you know a fact about geography, but forgotten in my body, in the daily going of things. I had forgotten what it felt like to come in from work and have the house be different because someone was in it. I had forgotten what it felt like to eat a meal across a table from someone and talk, or not talk, and both ways be all right. I had forgotten, if I am honest, what it felt like to matter to anyone. I don't say this to make you feel sorry for me. I built what I built, and I built it on purpose, and I would do it again. But there was a cost to it that I had decided not to look at directly. Nora made me look at it. Not by talking about it, by doing the opposite, by treating it as finished, by acting from almost the very first morning as though I was a man worth considering, not a charity case, not a lonely bachelor who needed managing, a man with a working ranch and a clear head and the good sense to fix a firebox on a Sunday. She treated me as what I had actually built and become, and I am not sure I fully understood until she did it how completely everyone else in my life had been treating me as something less. The men in town were polite. Javier was loyal. The bank man in Deming was respectful in the way bank men are because I had money, but none of them saw me. They saw a category. The solitary rancher, the man who works alone. There are whole volumes of what people don't bother to see in a man like that. Nora looked at me like I was an actual specific person. It took some getting used to. We went to Deming in the second week of May to file the papers on the draw, which shut down Cole's argument completely, and I never heard from his hired men again. While we were in town, I conducted some other business. A conversation with the lumber yard about fencing timber, a conversation with the bank, and Nora waited at a dry goods store, and when I came to collect her, she was talking to the owner's wife with the ease of a woman who has always known how to be at home in a room, which I had begun to understand was a skill she'd had to earn the hard way. We ate at the hotel dining room before the drive back. It was the nicest room I'd eaten in years, white tablecloths and a man who poured water like he meant it, and Nora sat across from me in a dress she'd made up from fabric she'd bought at the dry goods, dark blue, simple, and looked at the menu as though it were a document requiring careful review. She ordered the chicken. I ordered the beef. We talked about the fence line and then about the cattle, and then she said, unprompted, "My mother thought I was foolish to come." I said, "What did you think?" She put her menu down. She looked at me the way she had looked at me on the platform, straight, no apology for it. She said, "I thought you'd built something worth seeing. I thought it might be worth my time to come and see it." I said, "And was it?" She said, "That depends on you." I held that. I turned it over. The man with the water pitcher came by and I waved him off, and I sat with Nora Holt in the hotel dining room in Deming, New Mexico, in May of 1888, and I thought about what she'd said and what it cost her to say it. Then I said, "I want you to stay, not as an arrangement, because it's where you ought to be." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the tablecloth and then back at me. She said, "I know you paid for Clara's fare." I said, "That doesn't matter." She said, "It matters to me. I'll work it off." I said, "Nora." She looked at me. I said, "That is not what I'm asking." She was still for a long time. Long enough that the waiter came with the food and set it down and went away again. The chicken and the beef and the white tablecloth and the evening coming through the big window, and Nora Holt sitting across from me with her hands in her lap and something working behind her face that I could not quite read. Then she nodded, small, definite. She said, "All right." We were married in June by a circuit preacher who came through once a month, and who had the good sense to say only what was necessary and stop. Javier shook my hand afterward with both of his. He was not a sentimental man, and this was as much as he would do, and it was enough. The town had opinions, which they kept mostly to themselves, which was wise of them. There were people who had heard I'd sent for Clara Holt specifically, the pretty one, and received Nora instead, and they found this fact interesting in the way small towns find things interesting that are not their concern. Nora was aware of this, and she met it the way she met most things. She did not argue with it or explain herself. She simply was herself consistently, until the fact of her became more interesting than the story about her. It took about a season. I want to tell you about one evening in September. The first light frost had come down from the mountains, and I'd spent the day moving cattle off the high grass to the south pasture. And by the time I got back to the house, my hands were stiff and my back had been informing me since noon that it was older than I sometimes acted like it was. I came in through the back and sat down at the kitchen table without taking my coat off, which is a thing I had not done since Rose died, in the way that small habits carry the weight of larger things. Nora was at the stove. She turned and looked at me. She said, "How bad?" I said, "I'm all right." She brought a cloth wrung out in hot water from the pot she kept for dishes, and she set it on the back of my neck without being asked, and stood behind me with one hand flat against my shoulder, not rubbing, not doing anything particular, just there. The weight of it. I sat there with the heat coming through the cloth and her hand on my shoulder and the kitchen smelling like whatever she'd put on to cook. It was something with onions. I remember the onions, and I thought, this is the thing I didn't know I was building toward. All of it. The well, the fences, the years of solitary labor in the heat and the cold, the long drives, the money, the arguments with men like Coles, the sleepless nights running numbers on the edge of a lamp's light. All of it had been building toward having something worth coming home to. Not a pretty house, not a working ranch. The warmth of someone's hand who knows what you've done all day and knows the cost of it and rests her hand on your shoulder because she knows and because she's chosen to. I reached up and put my hand over hers. She didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. The stove knocked and the cattle settled in the south pasture, and outside the window the early dark was coming down over the land I'd made, and Nora Holt Marsh stood behind me in the kitchen with her hand in mine, and that was everything. That was the whole of it. People ask me sometimes, people who have heard the story, how I felt when I saw it was Nora and not Clara on that platform. I tell them I felt cheated. And that's the truth. That's what I felt for the first 30 seconds, the particular sharp feeling of reaching for a thing and finding a different thing where it was supposed to be. But then she spoke, and she looked at me, and she said what she had to say with no more or less than the situation called for, and something in me that had been braced for a long time went quiet. I have thought about this since, about what it means that the woman I paid for was not the woman I needed. Whether that is luck or something with more intention in it, I can't say. I'm not a man who bends easily toward meaning in things. I believe mostly in what you can work with your hands and see with your eyes and record in a ledger. But I will say this. There are things in a life that can't be planned, that come in sideways when you were looking straight ahead, and sometimes they are the best things. Nora was the best thing. Not because she was soft with me, though she had her soft moments. Not because she made my life easier, though she made it better, which is different. because she looked at what I'd built with clear eyes and called it a real thing and meant it and then stayed to be part of it. Not out of obligation, not out of lack of options. She had gotten on a train of her own will and gone west and stepped off onto a platform and said her piece and made her choice. And her choice was this land and this man. And I knew it because she'd told me so. And I have never in my life been given a gift I valued more. A man can build everything alone. I know because I did it. But to be seen by someone who sees straight, that is not something you can build. That is something you can only be given. Nora gave me that. I was smart enough, eventually, to stop being surprised by it. She is sitting on the porch as I tell you this. The September light is coming across the grass at the angle it comes in September, low and orange and long. And she has her coffee and the book she reads in the evenings and her feet up on the rail, and she is not looking at me, but she knows I'm here. And I know she knows. And that is the whole conversation. We have been married 6 years. The land is better than it was. The herd is better. The house, I added 2 rooms the summer of '90, when it became clear we needed them, and I built them myself mostly, with Javier's help on the heavy work. And Nora came out every morning to look at the progress, and one morning she said, "You set that corner square." And I knew she'd measured it with her eye the way she measured most things and found it good. That corner square. 6 years, and that's still the one I carry. 11 years working alone on this land, and I had built a working ranch and a reputation and 2,000 acres, and no one with the eye or the inclination to say, "That is set square, what you made. You made it right." I know the worth of what I built. I have always known. But there is a difference between knowing a thing in yourself and having it seen by someone you respect. A man can go a lifetime carrying the worth of what he's made and never have it spoken back to him. Never have a set of eyes look at what he's done and recognize it for exactly what it is. I don't go a day without it now. That's the thing about Nora. She doesn't perform seeing me. She simply does. It's not a gift she gives me, it's the way she operates, the way her eyes work, the way her mind runs. She sees what's in front of her and she calls it by its right name, and she doesn't look away. A man who spent 10 years unseen would know what that is worth. I know what it is worth. The light is going now, moving west the way it does, and Nora has closed her book and is holding her coffee cup with both hands and watching the dark come in from the east the way we both do in the evenings, because there is something about the dark coming that deserves witnessing. I'll go sit with her in a minute. I just wanted to tell this first. Someone ought to know how it was.